was working on my sermon this week, and I got this video, and I thought it fit in well as it talks about how Jesus, and he came and spoke to the world of his day, and how his message spread from person to person, from country to country, to nations and to kingdoms. My topic today is thinking about Jesus as what he would say to our country, our nation. And the topic of Jesus is becoming more and more controversial. Actually, when I was a kid, I was born in the 60s, sort of the wild 60s as they're known, but really, Jesus wasn't so controversial then. You could pray in a public school, you could talk and do so many things. Whereas now, that video that we just watched ended where Jesus is divisive. On one hand, he's the most revered person of all time, and on another hand, some people despise his name. But Jesus comes into this world and he speaks. He speaks to you and me. He speaks to people everywhere. And just thinking, what would Jesus say to this nation of ours? One thing is really the first thing is I went through all the passages talking about governments. And you know what? There's good and bad governments in the history of time. If you look at our government, you know what? We got a lot to be thankful for, right? I was thinking about our country. I've been in 39 of the 50 states. I've never been in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. I've never been in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and I've never been Alaska and Hawaii. But I've been in 39 of the 50 states, and it's incredible. The variety of environments, the people, and all that goes on around the country. You know what? You look at it and you say, well, we got a lot to be thankful for. We live on the land filled with opportunities, people coming up with ideas, people starting things. Farms. Farmers today grow food in 100-fold of what they used to do 100 years ago. And so now the case is only 1% of our society are farmers anymore. It used to be 50% of the people in America used to be farmers. Now 1% can grow all the food we need and still ship a third of it overseas. Sometimes people complain about our government, but as a whole in the history of the world, it's pretty good. As an example of that, I put in the Old Testament reading the story of Ahab and Jezebel acquiring Naboth's vineyard. I don't know if you're familiar with that passage. And it's a passage about Ahab and Jezebel were the king and queen of Israel, and they were known as the most rotten, no good king and queen in the history of Israel. And as in some of the examples they gave, Ahab wanted to buy Naboth's vineyard, and Naboth said, no, that's my dad. I got this farm from my dad. He got it from my grandfather. He got it from my great-grandfather, and he got it from my great-great-great-grandfather. I can't sell this farm. And you may have something like that that's been passed down through generations. And he wouldn't sell the farm. And he came home, and his wife said, what's wrong? Why the sad face? Said Naboth wouldn't sell me his family farm. Jezebel said, I'll take care of it. Then she framed him, invited him to a big dinner, had two scoundrels sit opposite him, and then basically say he cursed God and the king. And in those days, justice was swift and severe, with two witnesses, and Naboth was killed. And that is sort of synonymous with the government of Israel, even in that time, which was sort of the rock bottom of Israel's government. And you know what? Even our worst president was never that bad, right? And that's really rock bottom and hitting the thing. When we think about our country, there is so much that we need to be thankful for. And God, throughout all the scriptures, says to be thankful for the government you have, because you know what? Even if it's rotten, you know what? It's better than nothing. The only place right now in the world, that came to mind when you think of no government, you read about Somalia lately, right? Somalia, there is no government. And you know what flourishes in Somalia when you have no government? Pirates. Who are, there's the movie Captain Phillips out of the theaters right now. Pirates come from Somalia because the pirates really run the country. So they can go out and hijack ships and do whatever they want with them And you know what? When there's no government at all, you have no idea what the world is going to have. And terrible things do happen. Jesus says, be thankful for the government you have. You know, when I use the children's sermon analogy, you know what? The glass is even more than half full. There's a lot to be thankful for when we think about that. We thank God for the nation we have in which we live. The second thing, when I went through all the passages about government in our nation, it came up a couple of times, several times in fact, and then Paul mentions it in the Romans letter, in the gospel reading that Jesus spoke about today. Another controversial issue that we have in government all the time is taxes. How many of you love taxes? Not a single hand. I bet if I asked the kids that, maybe somebody will say, oh, I like taxes, you know. They haven't experienced them yet in their life. But you know, taxes have never been popular. Some taxes I don't care about. You know what? When the Revolutionary War, they got all bent out of shape over tea taxes, right? Frankly, I don't drink tea. They could tax tea all they want. I don't care because I don't drink it. I think it's because of the Revolutionary War we became a coffee-drinking nation. So tea has always been sort of looked upon as a British, problem. So we want nothing to do with that. British tea. American Colombian coffee. That's what we like, right? Taxes were not popular then. Did you know even in Jesus' day they were even more and more controversial because they were asked to pay taxes with Roman coins. And in that gospel reading I read, they figured, you know what, the tax question will trip Jesus up. If he says yes, the people will hate him. And if he says no, he's a tax cheat. We'll get the Romans to get it. And so they came to Jesus and to challenge him. They said, do we pay taxes? And Jesus says, I know what you're trying to do. Give me a coin. How do you pay your taxes? They handed him a Roman denarius. And on the face of it, it's one of the Caesars. Probably in Jesus' day, it might have been Augustus Caesar. Or at that time, there's coins about Tiberius Caesar, who was not in the thing. But there's usually a portrait. We put on our coins presidents. The Romans put Caesars. What was even more hateful to the Jews of Jesus' day, on the coins were written that Caesar is God. And they didn't want to touch those coins. They didn't like those coins one bit. And Jesus says, whose picture is there? And so, well, that's Caesar's picture. And then Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. If you don't want to pay taxes, you know what the Bible says? Give up money. And you know what happens if you give up all your money? Then you don't have to pay taxes, Then that's sort of how it rolls. And you know what? If you get rid of all of your money and you don't have any, it's a hard time being taxed. But we do want money also in that sense. And so the second thing Jesus would say is, you know what? Pay your taxes. Be good citizens. Make the country in which you live a better place. That's one thing the church has always done. It's been a force within any nation, wherever they are, to make it a better place where people can live and grow and prosper. The last thing as I was going through all the passages about God and government and nations is see everything in perspective. And I really started thinking about this last week. I was at a pastoral conference in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was there Monday through Thursday. But Wednesday, I was sitting next to a pastor. Well, he's in the SMP program that Bill and Kurt are in. But he works up at Ascension Lutheran Church in Montreal. He's Chinese. His name I have a hard time remembering. I think it's Wei Chun Lin, something like that. And he's a pastor at Ascension Lutheran Church in Montreal, and he has a Chinese congregation. He speaks very little English, broken English. And so we didn't have a very in-depth conversation. We talked a little bit. But he gave a presentation about some of the work he's doing with the church, with the Chinese in Montreal that's small and growing, but actually the bigger sense of ministry he's doing is back in China. He has a blog. He was involved in Tiananmen Square, I think it was like 20 years ago. Do you remember how long ago Tiananmen Square was? He was one of those on the street, leading that, and then he left China as a political refugee and went to Canada. But then became a Christian and started writing to the Chinese about faith in Jesus. And he showed his blog, he projected his blog up on the thing, and you know how many hits his blog has had in the last 10 years? Over 15 million. Bill, how do we get 15 million hits? Gangnam Style. Dance, you gotta dance, I guess, or something. But then he did 15 million in China. Just thinking about that. 15 million hits in his pastoral blog in China. It's amazing, and just thinking about that. And he told the story about when he went back to China a couple of years ago. He left as a political refugee, and he asked for a visa to go back and visit a lot of his family. He wanted to go back and visit his mother. He's about my age. He wanted to go back and see his mother we hadn't seen in 15 years. And the Chinese government gave him a visa to go back to China. He arrived in China. He got off the plane, though. But following him the whole time he was in China were two guys in suits and sunglasses, walking about 10 feet behind him. And then after they followed him to his mother's house, parked in front of the house, he asked them, well, who are you guys? And he said, we're with the government. He said, are you going to be with me the whole time I'm here in China? And he said, yes. And they said they have some rules. You can go visit your family. You can go visit friends, but you can't go in a room with more than 10 people in it. They didn't want him talking at a church. They didn't want to talk him at a political rally. They said, as long as you're in a room with less than 10 people, you're fine. You won't be arrested. But if you try to go talk to a big group, we're going to take you away. And he talked about it. He said, you know what? All right, I can live with that. The big thing is I want to go back and see my mom, see some siblings, see some close friends. And he spent some time in China. But he came back home to Montreal. And he keeps writing his blog and using the means that he has available to do ministry in China today. And you know what? That's doing great. One of the biggest things as we think about the mission of the church and the world around us, we live in a more contentious age. That video right up at the end, as it started talking about Jesus, he's the most revered, adored, respected person of all time, but also he is the most hated, despised. Because as you hear Jesus speak, you hear his words in total, you come to a fork in the road and you either say, he's who he says he was, he's the Son of God, or he's a fraud. An imposter. But millions and billions of people have said, you know what? He's the Son of God, who walked on water, who stood outside graves and tombs and rotting corpses like Lazarus. And Lazarus, come out of the tomb. And Lazarus came out. Who put his arms around people. People who thought nobody cared. He came to realize the Son of God would give his life for them. just as he died for each and every one of us. That's the message that we as the church share with our nation. And we share with the world in a variety of different ways, supporting the pastor in Montreal. We also support, the Rock Roars, a missionary family that they were teaching in South Africa, but they just got moved to Ethiopia. The church in Ethiopia goes back a long way. Remember, there's an Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts who was baptized. And the church in Ethiopia goes back all these years, and there's a big Lutheran church, actually, that was about 30 years ago. It was about 1 million members, the Lutheran Church of Ethiopia. But then the government cracked down and says you can't be Christians in Ethiopia. And there was persecution for about 15 years. And do you know what happened to the church during the 15 years of persecution? It grew from 1 million to 4 million. And then now they've lifted persecution. The church is continuing to grow and doing great. And the one problem is they don't have anybody to train all the pastors. So my friend Carl and his wife, they just moved to Ethiopia. And now they're teaching at this big seminary, Lutheran seminary in Ethiopia, for all the new pastors they need. Because the church is exploding and doing great. We sometimes complain about persecution, saying you can't pray. Well, the one thing is to remind you can pray wherever you want to pray. Don't let anybody stop you from praying, because you can't be stopped from praying no matter where you're at. You can do it with your eyes open. But as we live in an age that Jesus is more controversial, and our society sometimes says, well, you can't do that. God wants us in a winsome way, as God has done throughout all of history, to proclaim to the world the wonders and the message of Jesus. And that's what we in the church do today. And that's what Jesus says to us to do in our nation. And we do it in the various ways that we speak. We do it now on the internet. The best way is person to person. Telling the wonders, the incredible message of Jesus. And that's just what he did. And that's what he wants every one of us to do as the people of God.